Hey, welcome everyone joining in on the call. Thanks for joining us here. We just opened up the webinar here, so we're going to give it a couple minutes and give folks a chance to join, and we'll start here in just a couple minutes past the hour. Again, thanks for joining. Really excited to have you all on the call here. I see a bunch more people joining now. Just wanted to reiterate what I just said. Thank you all for joining. We're going to start here just a couple minutes past the hour, give folks another minute or two to join up. But thank you all for jumping on right here at the hour, and we'll get started here shortly. Awesome. Just one last time, because I see some more folks jumping in here now. Thank you all for joining. We'll get started here in just a moment as we give the last few folks a chance to jump on here. But thank you all again for joining, and we'll get started here shortly. Okay, I think we have enough folks here joined in on the call that we can get started. So once again, thank you all for joining us here on our webinar today, hosted by Logic.io and Salesforce. Really excited for this session today. We have two awesome speakers who are veterans in the CPQ space, I'll say, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But really excited for them to talk on our topic today on the 5 pitfalls to avoid when selecting and implementing a CPQ solution, with really a focus around future-proofing your business by making sure that you're getting the right selling tools as part of your tech stack. So really excited to hit on this topic today, and I think Erwan and Chris have a ton of expertise to share on this topic that we're excited to share with you as well. So just to do some housekeeping to start, we'll set the agenda here. Like I said, I'll go into a brief introduction of our speakers here today. We'll then go into those 5 pitfalls or those 5 mistakes to avoid based on Chris and Erwan's experience. And we'll go through each of those one by one with some best practices on how to avoid those mistakes next time you're evaluating and implementing CPQ. And then at the end, we'll actually go into 3 ways that you can go about specifically future-proofing your CPQ technology and where these two see the future of CPQ technology going so that you can ensure that you're future-proofing your sales tech stack and your sales systems. And at the end is when we'll do Q&A. So throughout the session today, as Chris and Erwan are speaking, feel free to go leave some questions in the Q&A box at the very bottom. We'll go ahead and address those at the very end, but feel free to leave those in as we go. Another quick housekeeping item, this session will be recorded and we will have the slides ready for you by the end of the day after this session as well. So you will have those to distribute with your team as well. Awesome. Well, without further ado, we will jump right into it, starting with the introductions of our speakers today. So you can see here on the call, we have Erwan Kerebel and Chris Haussler on the call today. As a means of introduction here, Erwan is the Senior Director of Product Management at Salesforce Revenue Cloud, focused on quote to cash and billing. Erwan was formerly at Apttus, another CPQ company, later acquired by Conga, where he was the Director of Sales Engineering over there for over 6 years, where he oversaw a ton of CPQ evaluations and implementations, as he does currently at Salesforce. So across a couple different CPQ companies, we'll get to hear from those experiences there. And then Chris Haussler as well, currently Senior Principal Product Manager here at Logic.io. Excited for Chris to share some of his knowledge here as well, because Chris spent over 7 years at BigMachines, and then even more years at Oracle CPQ after BigMachines was acquired by Oracle CPQ. So between our two speakers here today, we will have a really broad range of experiences, but really deep experience in CPQ evaluations and implementations from all of the years that they've overseen, many of them over time here. So really excited, Erwan and Chris, to have you on the call today. So just to jump right into it, I will hand it over to Erwan to kick us off, and we will get into the topics here.
All right. Well, thank you, Blake, for having me. Really happy to be here today and share some of my experience with the audience. I mean, as you said in your introduction, right, I've been in this space for quite a while now. Right? I think it's been a couple of decades now that I've been in the CPQ business, and CPQ solutions have become much more mature, right, in the last years. And I think vendors in general have done a great job generalizing CPQ and applying CPQ solutions to pretty much every single industry out there. And what we see and what you folks might see when you are evaluating CPQ solutions is that there's kind of a convergence of capabilities. And when you look at demos, you might think that CPQ solutions kind of look alike and have capabilities that are very similar. But I would encourage you to go a little bit beyond what you are seeing in the demos, because CPQ solutions are actually not equal, even though they might look the same. The other thing that I would like to warn the audience on as well is that even though you might think that CPQ has become kind of standardized, it doesn't mean in my mind that there's a universal recipe that will make your project successful. I still see many CPQ projects that fail for many reasons. One of them is that CPQ is complex, right? There's a lot of things, a lot of business processes that CPQ touches, and getting it right is not always obvious. And there's uniqueness in every single company, right? Uniqueness in terms of product catalog and pricing and use cases and objectives that people have in mind when they want to select a CPQ. So really to identify the right fit for your business, you really have to be very diligent and pay a lot of attention to your selection criteria when you are to select a CPQ solution, and you have to be very diligent as well when actually designing your CPQ solution that you have selected. So today, this is what Chris and I want to talk about. Right? We'd like to walk you through 5 common mistakes that we see being made when both selecting and also implementing your CPQ solution. So we'll start with the first one, which is regarding administration capabilities and maintenance of your CPQ solution. Right? As I said, kind of in my introduction, there are a lot of things that CPQ touches. Right? CPQ touches your product offers, your pricing, your promotions, your sales processes, your channel strategy, your ordering process, and also many other systems that you have in your tech stack. Right? CPQ is going to integrate with your CRM, with your ERP, with your billing system, and potentially with your e-commerce solution as well. And all of these things change. Right? So you'll have to adapt your CPQ implementation very quickly. So there are several things that I encourage folks to consider. Right? The first thing is pretty obvious when you are looking at demos. Try and have a look at the administration side of things. Try to understand what does it take to actually create a product. What does it take to create a configuration model? What does it take to create a role and approval workflow? What does it take to implement a document template for your quote or your proposal, for example? But also try and go beyond that as well, because you have to think about scalability as well, right? So not only what it takes to create the first product, the first bundle, the first configuration model, and implement the first processes for the first country, but also how do you scale from there? How do you go from one product to 200 products? How do you go from one country to 25 countries, for example, right? And this is where kind of the rubber meets the road for many CPQ solutions. So it's really important that you understand how you are going to scale from a limited number of products, limited number of countries and use cases to many products, many countries, many use cases, many automation that you have to solve when you are actually at scale. So think about how am I going to reuse some of the elements of my administration? How am I going to clone some elements? Are there some capabilities to inherit some setups, from one product to another? Is there an ability to load data from Excel, for example, in order to help me, create multiple rules with a minimum number of clicks or minimal effort, for example? The other thing as well that's really important is who will implement, who will maintain your CPQ solution. Do you want to do this internally? Do you want to, do you have resources on the staff who have expertise either in CPQ in general or on a given platform? Do you want to work with a system integrator? Does the software vendor force you to work with his own professional services? And in that case, you'll be captive. So chances are that the implementations will be going to be slower and more expensive. And also think about how these people are going to get trained. Right? Is there a training program available? Is there a certification program available? How are these people going to stay up to date in terms of capabilities? Right? Try simple things. Right? Try Googling. Right? How do I create a product in this CPQ solution, for example? Because Google is probably the go-to resource that people will go to in order to get information about how to do something in CPQ. So simple things like this help you evaluate how easy it's going to be to train your folks and keep those people up to date in terms of capabilities for the CPQ solution that you're about to select. So Chris, why don't you walk us through the next mistake that we have here?
Sure. So I honestly think that this mistake could be worth two, but we'll keep it at one pitfall. So settling for a subpar sales user experience. So of course, you are looking at CPQ because you want to essentially increase or ramp up your revenue engine, right? So there are a couple of different things that are key. So the first bullet on the slide basically says, all right, it comes down to speed. Speed can be measured a bunch of different ways. There is the speed of which getting a quote out the door, that metric at the top that basically says, if you actually complete the quote first and you get that in your customer's hands, you're more likely by 60% to get that deal. That's one measurement of speed. Another measurement of speed is just how your user interacts with the application. We've come to expect in our consumer lives that I'm not going to wait for a website that's going to churn for 2 to 3 seconds. I'm going to go somewhere else that can give me what I want. So why should your direct sales staff or your partners or your customers wait themselves? They're not going to. So speed is very important. And of course, when you're talking about a lightning fast config like Logic does, of course, we're not going to get away without talking about speed. And I would talk about speed and performance a couple of different ways. Of course, anybody can show you a demo that is fast and all of that, which is good, but demos are not the real experience. So I encourage you, much like Erwan said in the prior pitfall, don't be afraid to get under the hood with the vendor. Ask questions of current customers. Ask, what would happen if I actually need to blow this out? I have 100 times the rules that you're currently showing this demo. Actually look at, what some of your products require. And that's going to give you a greater measure of whether a vendor can satisfy your performance metric. Now, the second part of this pitfall, the speed and performance pitfall, is implementation. There is no end to the number of different ways that you can basically denigrate performance as a consequence of decisions and trade-offs made during implementation. And this is speed is kind of like a death by 1,000 cuts. So every time you are making a decision that sacrifices a little bit of user side performance for maybe it's a call out to the back office or it's because some other process is not optimal, take a second look at it, because that is something that those add up. And you definitely want to go into your sales experience, building your sales experience, buying your sales experience in your selection of CPQ and your implementation of it, making speed the centerpiece of the overall transaction. So the second bullet on pitfall number 2 is lack of guidance and flexibility. So generally, it says don't settle for experience that's good enough, because generally good enough really isn't. On the one hand, we've come a long way from, the back office ERP configs that had really just a limited view of how you could ask questions about a product. We've come a long way from that, but we've also got a long way to go. What I've seen happen a lot in implementation is that there's a lack of creativity. There is sometimes looking at one audience that needs to develop a quote and not at the wider breadth of audiences. We meet a lot of manufacturing customers that have a sales team that has been around for 5 to 10 years, and it's good they have been, because that's what it takes to become a good rep. They know their sales catalog, they know what they sell, and they know actually how to make it through a quote very quickly. But if you're that business and you actually want to grow your top line, what is the likelihood that you're going to find a ton of those people with 5 to 10 years of experience just ready to hit the ground running? No, you're actually going to be building your sales team with a different profile. So make sure that you have the flexibility to be able to provide guidance, ask questions in a different manner that actually gets to the heart of the product that should be recommended. This is the next step to actually bringing configuration and self-service, so your customers can actually work through the configuration themselves. So instead of just relying, and it's interesting because we've been put in front of a bunch of these sales reps that are really good at their jobs. And they basically said, no, I just want a config experience this way. But if you look at it from the perspective of the business that really needs to grow beyond, that one inside sales team, generally you need to look at how you can actually ask a questionnaire that varies according to the audience that's going to use it. So for this mistake on sales, subpar sales user experience, it comes down to 2 things. It comes down to performance, and it comes down to being able to deliver different experiences for different audiences.
Awesome, Chris, thank you. The next mistake we're going to talk about, and you'll see that there's a link between this mistake and the previous one as well. We'll talk about that. But the next mistake we're talking about is not considering that our world has shifted, right? And people expect several things, right? And you'll see in the numbers that are outlined in this slide here, right, that growing up the services revenue is top of mind for most companies these days, including manufacturers. And also there's an expectation from buyers that they can use whatever channel that they are more comfortable with in order to make a transaction with a company. So there's services and e-commerce are part of almost every single company out there. So this has to impact the way that you select your CPQ solution, and it has to impact as well the way that you implement your CPQ solution. If we talk about e-commerce first and self-service first, there are several things, right? Typically, what people would think about is, well, if I'm choosing a CPQ, what I want to do down the road is just expose what I have in CPQ on the self-service channel. And I want to expose pricing, I want to expose configuration, but things are a bit more complex than that. Obviously, for pricing, yes, we want consistent pricing between what you have in the sales-assisted channel and what you have in self-service, and ideally, you don't want to replicate the pricing logic between two systems, right? So that's a given. But for configuration, things are a bit more nuanced than that. Right? You can't just expose a user experience that's the best for sales reps. You can't expose that as is for your end customers, as Chris was saying, right? You don't want to have the same level of guidance for your sales reps and for your channel partners and for your end customers. And chances are you want to expose exactly the same options either, right? You might want to restrict choices of the most complex solutions to salespeople, right? And not let customers try to configure solution that would be too complex, based on their level of expertise, for example. The other thing as well is that what we see more and more is not self-service or sales assisted for a given transaction. We see more and more use cases. We see more and more journeys that mix channels together, right? For example, you might have a customer, trying to get product information online and start making some product selections online and maybe start configuring something online, but at some point they will need some help from a sales rep. So at some point you have to think about, how do I convert that and how do I trigger a request for quote process, for example. Or you might have a journey that starts with a sales rep for price negotiation. And once we have a price contract with the customer, then the customer might be ready to actually self-serve and reorder products very easily online. Right? So we see more and more journeys that mix channels like this. In order to make this doable, you have to think about how you are going to actually integrate at the transaction level, how you are going to convert a shopping cart into a quote, or how you are going to convert an order into a shopping cart, for example, for reorder processes. Right? So it's important that you think not only about exposing pricing and config online, but also how am I going to integrate at the transaction level as well in order to support those channel switching type of scenarios. If we talk about recurring services now, what we see more and more, and including in manufacturing, as I said, is that we see more and more companies that want to offer hybrid solutions that are composed of hardware and services. Right? It could be a maintenance contract, or it could be a truck manufacturer selling a subscription to a telematics offer, for example. Right? So and because of that, because we are now mixing hardware widgets with recurring services types of products, you can't have those two things managed by two different CPQ solutions. It has to be a single CPQ solution that allows a sales rep to create a quote that contains both types of revenue models. And not all CPQ solutions, again, are designed to support recurring revenue models. Recurring revenue models introduce a lot of complexity, and mainly because you are introducing two new use cases. Not only do you have to support the initial sale of a product, but you also have to support changes to a contract, right? Amendments, upgrades, downgrades in the middle of the contract, and then a renewal event as well at the end of that contract. And those events introduce a lot of complexity. So you have to have the right data model in order to support the storage of the install base changes along the life of the contract. And you also have to support the user experience that allows salespeople or even end customers to make those changes into a given contract. And that is not obvious for many CPQ solutions. The other thing that you have to think about is the financial impact as well. When you start talking about upgrades, downgrades, amendments, renewals, all of those events have an impact on how you are going to invoice customers and how you are going to recognize revenue. And those are areas where ERP solutions, traditional ERP solutions, are not too good at managing, taking into account the element of time. So again, think about that financial impact and think about the impact that this will have on your IT system as well. So it might be worthwhile to explore CPQ solutions that actually have some capabilities in order to help you manage those financial impacts in your transition to recurring revenue models. And with that, Chris, let's go to the next one.
So mistake number 4, addressing the inevitable gap. So we've talked a little bit about, the fact that you have many CPQ solutions that they're not all the same. And, at the same time, you also, the way that you market and go to market is usually a part of your secret sauce. So inevitably, there's going to be some sort of gap between what you want the system to do and what it natively does. And so part of your goal is to, in the evaluation process, find, what are those situations that are not going to be a perfect fit, and what am I going to do to mitigate them? So this is a fairly deep dive into how you want to sell. And I want to actually focus on that point quite a bit. And I think I don't mean to offend when I said earlier that people lack imagination or creativity when they get into implementation. But what we've seen over and over again is that you go into a CPQ project with quite a bunch of creativity, and then when it comes down to actually getting the implementation done, you end up, maybe an SI is going to do the implementation. You basically hand over, well, these are the tools that we've been working with for the last X number of years. Wrong way to go about it. So what you really want to look at is, what is the ideal way to go to market? What is the ideal way to usher your different sales teams, your customer facing teams through a product discussion? And that's what CPQ should be doing for you. So in the evaluation process, it is finding that tool that allows you to do as much of that as possible. And then, for those things that aren't perfect, kind of understand what the workarounds are. So that usually means, find a CPQ that gives you not only just a fit for purpose, but also, not just an application, but a platform that you can build other tools around. And usually an ecosystem of other SIs, people that have experience in the space, especially using the software, and also, handling those one-off kinds of requests that you may have here and there. So this is a bit of, choose something that has a little more meat around the bone on the application, and the kind of talent around the application that can get you to actually the nirvana of that secret sauce. So we'll talk about this a little bit in the future as well. This is key. And of course, Logic and Salesforce are a great combo, with Logic being very fit for purpose. It is that questionnaire to drive the sales experience, with the Salesforce platform around it, providing a lot of different opportunities should there be any gaps in your process.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Great points. And the next pitfall, we like to address some elements that will probably resonate with some of what you shared earlier as well. This last pitfall is probably, in my mind, the most frequent mistake that we see being made by people selecting and implementing CPQ solutions. Is what we call a lift and shift approach. As we said earlier, right, CPQ has been around, and we see more and more companies that have a legacy CPQ solution that are willing to actually change. And there are some behaviors that we often see. In this case, when people have a legacy CPQ solution, when they are actually selecting a CPQ solution, it's often kind of natural to think about capabilities through the lens of that solution that they have been using for years, and therefore just focus on the gaps that the solution had. I would caution the audience that this is a very, very dangerous thing. You should not use that familiarity with CPQ solution as a shortcut in your selection process. The other danger is really during the implementation. It becomes even more tempting to shorten the requirements gathering phase and simplify the user story drafting, because you really have a base of functionality in your legacy CPQ solution. And again, this is very dangerous for two main reasons. The first one is that the way that your company did business 10 years ago is probably very different from the way that you are conducting business now, or how you want to conduct business now. And there are probably other reasons than just technical depth that pushes you to consider a new CPQ implementation. For example, it could be an acquisition, could be launching a new product line, or could be launching a new revenue model, or addressing new markets, or launching a new channel. And chances are that you will not reach your objectives if you just reproduce what was done before and address a few gaps. The other reason why lift and shift is very dangerous is that every CPQ solution, even though they might look similar from the outside when you look at a demo, every CPQ solution has its own set of best practices for a given use case. and what might be a good or a decent design approach for a given CPQ solution, it might be a terrible design option for another CPQ solution that might lead to a poor user experience, a poor performance, or a terrible maintainability. So it is critical in my mind that design decisions when implementing CPQ are done and informed and match actually your selected tools capabilities, not the previous tools capabilities. And to that regard, there's also something that's very important in my mind. And I think this will address a question that was asked earlier as well in the Q&A. To me, even if you are not implementing CPQ yourself, even if you are contracting a system integrator to implement CPQ, it is critical to get educated on the CPQ solution that you've selected. Right? There are, in the case of Salesforce and Logic, there are a lot of resources that you can use. Right? For Salesforce, you can go to trailhead.com and get access to a free environment and start, testing things and get trained on some specific areas of CPQ. In my mind, it's very critical that you get educated because during the implementation, you will be making some design decisions that you'll have to live with for the rest of your CPQ life. So it's critical that those design decisions are made based on well-educated knowledge of the CPQ tool capabilities. And with that, I think this concludes what we wanted to share in terms of pitfalls and mistakes. Before we go into Q&A, we wanted to talk a little bit about what's coming as well in CPQ, what we see in the market, what we see as future trends and future capabilities that will be provided by CPQ vendors. So let's jump through that now.
Sure. So if you look at the history of CPQ, it's been growing in this direction for quite a long time. I think it was sometime in the last 15 years that Gartner actually coined the term CPQ. Before that, it was a bunch of either different sales tools or manufacturing configurators that were put in front of sales for order taking. But generally, Gartner looked at this and said, "Oh, here are the common tasks that this tool should actually do." And generally, the applications that fit into this category grew up through one or another industry. And as time has gone on, these have kind of come together, kind of as Erwan mentioned earlier, so that there's a decent amount of capability amongst most applications, but generally it is still an application. And I did mention this earlier. What we are seeing is that the true CPQ that is going to be valuable into the future is going to be more of a platform concept. Because CPQ, it's interesting, CPQ in most sales evaluations and vendor evaluations involves a huge number of people because so many different departments touch it. You're talking about everybody from finance to sales operations to manufacturing. They all care because they all have a piece of the pie. So certainly, the ability to actually tie CPQ into all of those other systems and come up with the unknown gaps that get discovered along the way, that's going to require more than just one application. And hence, we actually keep on saying, the platform is it. And going forward, we're going to find much more that CPQ is going to be probably rated on the platform that it fits into rather than just the application itself. So that's the first kind of transformation that we're seeing in the market.
Yeah, the second area that has already transformed CPQ to some regard, and it will continue to transform CPQ, is artificial intelligence and machine learning. We've seen AI and ML gain traction already for some sub use cases in CPQ. Right? So you'll see solutions like Salesforce that have introduced leveraging AI and ML for things like pricing guidance, for example, or product recommendation. And many customers are already leveraging those capabilities. But I think that the next frontier, the next big thing is going to be leveraging AI and ML on the configuration side as well. And there's tremendous value there as well. I think we have to manage expectations though. Right? When talking to customers, right, I hear sometimes sort of hope that AI and ML is going to replace rules and constraints in their configuration models, and therefore make CPQ implementations much easier. I don't think that's going to be the case. I don't think AI and ML anytime soon will be able to tell you whether a given configuration is manufacturable or whether a given configuration is something that we can sell for a given customer. So you always need those rules, those constraints in order to make sure that what's being offered in CPQ is actually a valid configuration. Where I think that AI and ML can bring a lot of value is helping capture tribal knowledge. Right? Chris was mentioning earlier, right? Sales teams that sometimes have 5 years, 10 years experience. This is becoming less and less frequent. Right? Manufacturers especially are facing huge turnovers in their industries and have been facing huge turnovers lately. So this tribal knowledge that sales reps used to rely on is slowly disappearing. So AI and ML is actually a great opportunity to actually replace that tribal knowledge and capture that tribal knowledge and provide recommendation at the time of configuration. I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of capabilities to offer this. But one thing that I would recommend the audience to consider when both selecting and implementing CPQ as well is think about the data strategy, right? Because the way that you design your CPQ solution today, right, your design decisions today will impact how the data is going to look like later, and therefore how applicable this data will be for AI and ML. Right? So again, I don't think that for now, CPQ solutions are really ready to provide this level of recommendation at the time of configuration, but you can already think about how you structure your configuration models and how this impacts the way that data is going to look like, because the data is really the main source of information for any AI and ML algorithm. So if you have bad data or poorly architected data, this is going to make usage of AI and ML later on much more complicated.
No matter how smart the AI and ML ever get, it's always going to be a human-based strategy that actually drives it home. So it's been fascinating to see kind of the hype cycle that's gone around AI and ML. And I think, there's some very valid uses for it, but it will never actually replace, the true strategy of how you bring revenue in the door. So another kind of future looking facet is make sure that you're actually looking at CPQ as an omni-channel opportunity. So we've particularly noticed that the COVID pandemic over the last 2-3 years has sped this up quite a bit. It was already happening. That whether you look at the changing demographics of who is buying and the fact that millennials don't like to talk to people, or it is just the need to do more faster. What we were finding is all sorts of different data that supports the fact that people want to self-serve. So what might have previously been a large complex transaction that included, a bunch of back and forth with inside sales or a partner and someone that is a buyer in an organization, frequently that buyer just wants to actually self-serve. So certainly you're not going to get rid of your direct sales, your partners, but an understanding that at least the initial testing and trying out and looking at different options is probably going to need to be done. They need to be able to self-serve that way. And then if they actually want help, allow them to get that help wherever they are in that process. That's part of the omni-channel. So Similarly to kind of what we talked about earlier, where you need to have that flexibility for different audiences, the ability to not only reuse some of that logic that you built for your direct sales, but to also repurpose it perhaps in a different experience for your self-service kinds of channels. That's incredibly important. And I think it's going to continue to be much more important in the future. And certainly some CPQs do this better than others. You will find that some don't have an ability to do a self-service channel at all. Some make it very difficult to provide different experiences using the same logic. This is something that is good to kind of dip into when you're evaluating a vendor. Let's get some examples about how you would actually present this to a different audience, because chances are your business is actually going to need to move that way at some point or another.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris and Erwan, for rolling through those pitfalls and kind of the future-looking state of CPQ. Just a reminder for folks here on the call, we'll jump into Q&A right now after this. So please go ahead and leave some questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those here. Just a quick reminder here for folks who might not know a lot about Logic and Salesforce's partnership. Logic.io is what we call a commerce logic engine, which for the CPQ use case is really focused on the C of CPQ and helping to augment the capabilities of CPQ. And the partnership between Logic and Salesforce and the integration between the two has been really great to see here, and how we've been able to achieve a lot of the things that Chris and Erwan have talked about here today in terms of offering fast, flexible, omni-channel experiences across platforms. So if you do want to learn more about how that works, please feel free to reach out to us. You see the links that we have here, and feel free to reach out to us here as well. So thank you all again for joining here on this call. We'll jump into the Q&A now. Erwan, you alluded to this question earlier, but there was a lot of talk around on this session around the resources that are required when it comes to implementation and maintenance of CPQ. And one of the questions we had was that, to take a step back, there's a fundamental decision that exists around whether you should be leveraging internal resources versus external service resources and SI, professional services, whatever it may be. What are your kind of recommendations in terms of best practices on how they should assess which direction that they should go in if you're a company assessing your CPQ implementation?
Yeah, I mean, it's in my perspective, it's really a matter of preference. There's no right or wrong with any solution, whether you're using internal resources or a system integrator for your implementation, or whether you're using, again, internal resources or managed services for the ongoing maintenance. There's no right or wrong. It's a matter of preference and strategy. So what I would encourage people to do is when you are evaluating CPU solutions, favor those vendors that actually give you a choice in terms of what was the best approach for implementation and ongoing maintenance. And whatever the decision that you make, again, get educated. Even if you don't plan on actually supporting the solution yourself, or if you don't plan on implementing yourself, which is perfectly fine, and there are a lot of good reasons for doing that. Get educated, understand what it takes to actually do things in CPQ, understand the basic concepts in CPQ, so that when you have a partner who tells you, hey, in order to update this price list, I'm going to need to do this and this, you understand the pros and cons of various options that are going to get presented to you. That's really my main message today, is even if you are not actually implementing yourself, even if you are not maintaining yourself, you need to understand the decisions that are going to be made, because design decisions in CPQ are critical, and design decisions that are made early are design decisions that you're going to have to live with for a long time, and that might have very important impact on UX and scale and performance of your solution. So again, I can stress enough the fact that people need to understand what their CPQ is doing, how it's architected, and what are the best practices for a given use case for that CPQ solution.
Got it. We had another question, and your advice may be similar here as well. The question was related to our section around speed and performance and responsiveness, right? And how, especially for larger customers who have a certain degree of complexity to their pricing or to their product configurations and things like that, it can be pretty in-depth, and it can be pretty difficult even for a customer that's doing the CPQ evaluation, for the folks who are doing the evaluation themselves, to really fully even be able to articulate those complexities and be able to translate that over into the requirements for their CPQ solution. So the question around that is, how would you recommend that this, information is captured, and how that is actually requested or identified, whether it's through the evaluation process or through, a formal RFP or RFQ, in order to make sure that they're actually capturing all of those requirements and all of those needs up front, so that they make sure they're getting that solution that fits their complexity.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm a little biased perhaps, but I don't think this normally comes out in an RFP or an RFQ. What it does come out in is in a detailed discussion with the vendor, where you're basically going to lay out that, this is my the complexity of my product BOM, or this is the complexity of my pricing. Can you show me how you've done this before? And in many ways that you can actually usually look at a demo that they've done and kind of say, all right, if I multiplied this times X, because of a certain data set that you know of in your business, let's talk about what that would look like. And that will usually bring up some boundaries where you'll kind of go, okay, so this is going to point you toward a certain kind of implementation strategy. And you can actually have an intelligent conversation about that, rather than it being left until implementation, when you might be a little too far into your decision. So try to ask as many upfront questions as possible, and chances are, complex pricing models, complex bills of material, the vendor should have dealt with it previously and should be able to give you a nuanced answer about some of the different ways to accomplish it. Again, there should not be just one way, but generally, when we're talking about speed and responsiveness, that vendor probably has a go-to answer that would be good to discuss.
Great. I'm going to bounce around to a couple product specific questions too, and then we'll go back to some more general questions. We had a question around, the estimated time that it takes to implement Salesforce CPQ for a company that already uses Sales Cloud, Erwan. So obviously, I'm sure the answer is it depends to a certain extent, but I'm sure you have an answer there.
Yeah, it's a very tough question to answer, because the time it takes depends on so many factors, such as the complexity of the product catalog, the complexity of the pricing, complexity of the products themselves, are they configurable or not, number of countries that we are going to hold this up to, right? The variation in terms of processes between those countries, right? Document templates, approval workflows, those type of things, and then integration as well is a big part of that as well. So it really depends. I mean, this very simple implementation, could take 6 weeks, but very complex implementation could take much longer than that, and it could take a year or sometimes more for global implementations of very complex processes, right? So again, very wide range here, but without knowing the context, without knowing those elements that I talked about, it's very hard to give it a more precise range to that question.
If I can back on that a little bit, Erwan, I think, a lot of it is kind of dependent on the preparation that's gone into it. In my experience in implementation, frequently you run into situations that the implementer is asking questions that the business hasn't really thought of before, and they kind of go, we should go back and think about that a little bit. so that we can provide the best experience for how we want to sell in the future. And that's, that is part of the fun and the difficulty of CPQ, is that this is an opportunity to actually revise how you get revenue into the business. And that's a very important number of decisions that need to be made. So frequently the time that is estimated in implementation stretches out because you run into those decisions that need to be made, and some cycles need to be taken away from hands-on keyboard to actually get a direction. So I do know that, from a logic point of view, one of the things that we've taken as a guiding principle is, make this fast. If you have your strategy already baked out, make this as fast as possible to be able to get up and running, so that the technology is not the foot on the brake between you and a go live. But there are many decisions that go into a CPQ implementation.
Yeah. Two-part question here for you, Haussler. We had a question come in that said, is Logic better suited for clients with just complex product structures or configurations, or is it also useful even for clients that might have more simple product structures but are just looking to enhance their experience for their sales team and things like that?
So it's actually to both. Of course, we come from a bunch of folks that are steeped in the super complicated, really difficult pumps and turbines and all of that. But we've realized that this kind of guided selling experience is necessary for all sorts of businesses, not just the complicated. It's basically helping that user understand and provide the right inputs that get them to the right product, whether the product is complicated or not. We have recently been working with a few e-commerce vendors where the product, frankly, is not complicated, but to be able to get the customer to those solutions that are going to be perfect for them, it takes a few questions. And I find that the ability to actually customize your and provide a dynamic questionnaire that really presents it in an intuitive, kind of engaging way for a customer, that is part of what Logic provides, not just the complicated gears and nuts and bolts. So it can go both ways.
Gotcha. Follow up to that, Haussler, and Erwan here as well. How do Salesforce CPQ and Logic work side by side? Do you need to move all of your products over into Logic if you're going to use that, or can they work side by side and kind of teams work alongside each other?
Do you want me to take a stab at that, Erwan?
Sure.
All right. So Logic is intended to leverage the Salesforce data model. So you're defining your products in the standard, product to object, and Logic basically does whatever it needs to do to make that available at runtime. You don't have to worry about it. There is additional, of course, the rules that are going to drive some of your logic are going to be defined in Logic. But the idea when you are administrating logic.io is it's essentially a bolt-on to Salesforce administration. So the idea is that it's the same administrator and they work seamlessly together.
Yeah, and Logic leverages a capability that we have in Salesforce CPQ that's called the external configurator plugin, which makes the user experience seamless for a user. So a user putting together a quote is going to seamlessly, move from a Salesforce screen where he selects the product to a Logic screen where he configures the product and without even noticing it. And yeah, back to what Chris was saying, there's no replication of complex product structure or complex product rules between Salesforce and Logic that's required.
Gotcha. To take a step back, and this is a question I can go to either of you here. It's in reference to the conversation around, the movement to subscriptions and usage-based and hybrid business models. And the question is around, oftentimes, especially when there are these hybrid business models, that means that the requirements for the system and that the project actually has a lot more to it when it comes to the implementation there. So there's a trade-off that needs to happen sometimes in terms of, do you go for a specific use case and go faster to market with your CP, so to speak, with your CPQ solution, or make sure that you get the full rich set of functionality in order to cover your business model, and make sure that you're covering your business fully. How do you manage that trade-off, or kind of what is your guys' recommendation on that approach?
I mean, there are pros and cons with any approach, and that's true for any CPQ decision. Obviously, I mean, the tool should not direct what your strategy is, right? So if your company's strategy is to implement recurring services, then you should not change that strategy based on the CPQ solution or based on the CPQ implementation. So the decision really is whether, if you are implementing subscriptions, whether you are going to implement them in CPQ or not. And the rule of thumb I would say is, I mean, it's okay to have a staggered approach in your CPQ implementation, as long as for a given use case, you are not asking salespeople to actually use two different tools. All right. So if I'm a sales rep and I'm working on a deal for a customer, and for this deal I'm going to propose some widgets and some subscriptions, then the user experience will just be terrible if I had to use CPQ, Salesforce CPQ and Logic for one part of my deal, and then another solution or some very manual steps in Excel for the other part of the deal. So that's really the main guidance I would give is, for a given use case, for a given audience, try and make it so that there's only one solution that's being used by the sales rep, right? Otherwise, the user experience is just going to be terrible. So maybe there are some intermediate options to consider as well. I assume if you want to have a minimal approach, right, you could implement CPQ in a way that allows you to actually quote both widgets and services on the same quote, but then rely on some manual processes for some of the downstream processes, for example. Right? Those might be options that might be worth considering.
Got it. I think we have time for one more question here. I know we have a few more in the chat. So if we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you. Please follow up with us and we'll make sure to answer those questions. But for the last one here, we had a question around our insights that we shared here, Erwan and Chris, around the move to e-commerce, right? And the move to omni-channel that a lot of companies are experiencing. And I think we're all seeing that happen fairly quickly. The question is, do you envision that both CPQ and e-commerce markets will continue to grow together as this shift happens? Or do you envision that, the CPQ market will shrink as e-commerce grows? I would love to get your thoughts on that.
So I have a particular take on it, and part of it is the nexus, or the reason for the nexus of logic. We believe that CPQ will continue growing, definitely, but we think that e-commerce is going to grow that much faster. I don't think e-commerce is going to eat CPQ's lunch because there are actually needs for both. And one of the reasons why logic has come to exist is it is that sales experience that can be plugged into both. It allows the reuse of rules and definitions so that you can actually define something that goes into a CPQ that might be serving your partners and your direct sales, and perhaps a different experience that you're putting out in front of your self-service customers. I don't think one necessarily, it's not a zero-sum game. They will both be growing.
Great. Awesome. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time here, and we're just about at the hour. So Thank you so much, first of all, Chris and Erwan, for sharing everything that you did here on this call. I thought this was a really, really insightful session. So thank you to you both. And thank you to everyone who joined us here on the call. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the call, we will follow up with the slides and recording shortly later today. And as you see here on the screen, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or follow-ups that you have for any of us. Awesome. Thanks so much again, Chris and Erwan.
Very much.